The English Channel was black and restless in the hours before dawn on June 6, 1944, a living thing that breathed salt spray and cold fear into every man who crossed it. And somewhere 23 kilometers off the French coast, Lieutenant Dean Rockwell stood inside the steel hull of landing craft. Tank 2273 radio handset clenched in his hand as if it were the only solid thing left in a world dissolving into shadow. The pre-dawn darkness broken only by the pale outlines of 32 Sherman tanks surrounding him, their canvas flotation screens raised high and stiff like medieval siege towers. Absurd and ominous at the same time. Machines designed for fields and roads, now floating uneasily on the open sea, waiting for the moment when history would demand everything from them. And when the message crackled through the radio confirming A hour at 0630, no one cheered, because everyone already knew what waited ahead. Heavy fortifications intact, beach obstacles identified, the German defenses untouched, and Captain Ned Elder of the 743rd Tank Battalion lifted his binoculars to study the 5-foot swells rolling toward Normandy, watching the water rise and fall with a rhythm that told him something no manual ever could, that the sea itself was an enemy today. And as he lowered the binoculars and made the decision that would define not just his battalion, but the fate of hundreds of infantrymen pinned behind steel obstacles and blood-soaked sand, he did not speak in grand terms or heroic language. He simply said the words that would save lives. The tanks would not swim. They would ride their landing craft all the way in, and no one on those decks could know that this quiet, practical choice, made in darkness and salt spray, would help trigger the most important armored breakthrough in the European theater, because the men staring toward the invisible French coastline had been taught something else entirely, that German armor ruled the battlefield, that tigers and panthers were apex predators, thick-skinned, long-gunned monsters backed by doctrine that turned the Norman countryside into a web of overlapping kill zones, each hedgerow a wall, each road a trap, each open field pre-measured for death. And yet inside those Sherman tanks, engines straining at 4 knots, Chrysler multibanks growling like exhausted beasts, beneath 33 tons of steel, there were men like Staff Sergeant Paul Reagan, standing half-exposed in a commander's hatch aboard LCT 600 counting ammunition, not because he loved numbers, but because numbers were reassurance. 90 rounds of 75mm shells, thousands of machine gun rounds, tangible proof that when the shooting started he would have something to fight with, something to give the infantry crouching behind wire and steel. And what those men represented went far beyond armor thickness or gun caliber, because thankfully, Sherman was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to be there built by the tens of thousands simple enough to ship across oceans and fix with basic tools, simple enough that farm boys from Kansas and Ohio could keep it running under fire. And while German tigers consumed resources like hungry gods, expensive and delicate, the Sherman rolled out of American factories in unstoppable waves, more than 2,000 a month at peak production, a quiet industrial roar that no battlefield heroics could silence, and tank commanders like William Fauquesade, hardened by training in the Arizona desert, understood something that didn't show up on armor penetration charts, that modern war was not a duel between champions, but a brutal equation of endurance, speed, replacement, and adaptation. While across the channel, inside the sloped steel of Panther 424, a German commander reviewed his ammunition load with calm confidence. 79 rounds for a gun that could kill a Sherman long before it could strike back. Thick frontal armor that American shells could barely scratch. A machine designed to dominate from prepared positions, but also one that drank fuel faster than Germany could supply it. A predator that was devastating only if it could stay still and wait. And at Omaha Beach, the defenses were designed exactly for that purpose. Years of work carved into concrete and earth machine gun nests like Wen 6.2 overlooking Easy Red, anti-tank guns hidden in shadows, mortar pits pre-registered on every inch of sand. Mathematical perfection, built to slaughter attackers before they could even stand up. And when dawn approached and the sea worsened, Captain Elder saw clearly what others would not, that the canvas screens meant for gentle waters would collapse here, that swimming tanks would simply vanish beneath the waves. And so while other battalions launched and watched their Shermans sink one by one into the cold channel, Elder kept his tanks aboard their landing craft, choosing to risk naval crews and thin hulls rather than drown his men without a fight. And at 0615, the naval bombardment began, the thunder of 14-inch guns from battleships offshore shaking the horizon, destroyers creeping dangerously close to fire point-blank at visible targets. But even that massive firepower failed to do what men hoped it would. Shells overshooting, bombs falling inland, the German defenses largely intact when the first ramps dropped. And at 0629, 1 minute before H hour, the Shermans of Company A rolled directly into deep water, exhaust stacks rising like chimneys, tracks grinding through surf and shingle as bullets sparked against steel like hard rain. The German response immediate and lethal, 88mm guns firing with terrifying speed, Shermans erupting in fireballs as ammunition cooked off, men dying inside steel boxes before they could even see the enemy. But still the tanks came, 40 of them by 0700, burning, bogged, crippled, yet firing back, hurling high explosive into machine gun nests that had slaughtered infantry moments earlier. And the effect on the Germans was instant and shocking, because they had trained for waves of men, not steel that could absorb bullets and answer with shells. And so individual Sherman crews fought isolated battles, radios drowned by salt water, each tank commander choosing targets by instinct and courage, absorbing hits from smaller guns and methodically destroying fortifications one by one, O-gunners raking trenches, main guns blasting concrete. And while infantry units on the beach bled nearly to extinction, naval officers watching through binoculars saw something else taking shape. Tanks moving forward, suppression growing, cracks appearing in what was supposed to be an impenetrable wall. And by the time General Omar Bradley contemplated abandoning Omaha entirely, those Shermans had already begun to tilt the balance. White phosphorus marking targets, burning its way into vision slits, and forcing defenders to flee. German requests for anti-tank support going unanswered because reserves were held inland, immobilized by fear of airborne landings that had already passed. And while German doctrine unraveled, the Sherman revealed its greatest strength not in firepower, but resilience. Crews repairing damage under fire, replacing track sections, coaxing engines back to life, making a wounded tank fight again when any German vehicle would have been abandoned. And when the first German assault guns appeared, they were outnumbered and destroyed by sheer volume of fire, not elegance, not superiority, but presence. And once the Shermans pushed past the seawall and engaged from the flank, the entire defensive system collapsed, because everything the Germans had built depended on keeping armor off the beach. And now that armor was inland, moving, adapting, refusing to stop turning what should have been a massacre into a grinding, costly advance, but an advance nonetheless. One that by mid-morning had shattered the illusion of an invincible Atlantic wall and replaced it with something far more dangerous for the defenders, the realization that the enemy was not only landing, but learning, fixing, and pushing forward tank by tank, crew by crew, steel after steel. And as the morning wore on and smoke rolled across the Norman coastline, it became clear to those still alive on both sides that something irreversible had begun, not because of brilliance or superior machines, but because imperfect tools, placed in determined hands, were doing exactly what they had been designed to do: arrive in numbers, survive punishment, and keep moving when everything said they should stop. As the morning stretched into afternoon on June 6th, the beach that had once seemed like the end of the world slowly transformed into something unthinkable just hours earlier, a place where men could stand upright, where engineers could work, where tanks could move inland, instead of burning helplessly at the waterline. And this shift did not come from any single heroic charge or brilliant maneuver, but from the quiet, relentless presence of American armor, pushing forward a few meters at a time, each Sherman acting not as a knight seeking glory, but as a shield for the men behind it, absorbing fear and fire alike. And while German commanders struggled to understand how their carefully constructed defenses were slipping away, Sherman crews were discovering that survival depended less on specifications and more on cooperation. Infantry pressed close to tank hulls, shouting warnings, pointing at hedgerows and windows. Men and machines moving together in a way that theory alone could never teach. And when German Panzerfaust teams began to appear in the bocage beyond the beach, deadly at close range and terrifyingly effective, the Americans did not panic as they once had in North Africa or Sicily. They adapted, infantry fanned out, tanks halted when unsure. Fire teams cleared hedges one by one, and the battlefield became a shared space rather than a collection of isolated duels. And as heavier German armor finally entered the fight, panthers stalking from tree lines and tigers lumbering toward the sounds of battle, the outcome no longer hinged on whether a Sherman could defeat a German tank head-on, because the Americans had learned to fight as a system. Smoke obscured vision, maneuver created angles, artillery softened resistance, aircraft prowled overhead like patient hunters. And when tigers burned disabled not by frontal penetration, but by flank shots and engine fires, something fundamental broke inside the German ranks. Not the steel of their machines, but the confidence that had sustained them through years of war and reports from the front grew grim and fragmented. Tanks lost faster than they could be replaced, crews exhausted, fuel scarce, retreat orders whispered but rarely organized, while on the Allied side losses were accepted with grim familiarity, Shermans knocked out, crews killed or wounded, but replacements already en route, ships unloading more steel, more men, more momentum, an industrial tide that refused to ebb. And within days the Norman countryside revealed itself as a new kind of enemy, ancient hedgerows that turned every field into a fortress, thick earth walls that lifted Sherman bellies into fatal exposure. And once again it was not superior engineering, but improvisation that changed the equation. Soldiers cutting apart German beach obstacles, welding crude steel teeth onto tank bows. The Rhino hedge-cutter, born not from doctrine, but from a soldier's simple observation. And when these modified tanks crashed through hedges, instead of climbing them, bursting into fields with guns already trained, German defenders lost yet another advantage they had counted on. And from that moment the rhythm of the campaign changed. Breakthroughs widened, movement returned, and Operation Cobra would later unleash the full weight of American combined arms. Thousands of aircraft tearing open the German lines, hundreds of Shermans surging forward through shattered bocage, the war transforming once more into a fast-moving struggle that favored those who could sustain pressure rather than those who relied on perfection. And as German divisions bled themselves dry, trying to stem the advance, their once feared armored formations shrank to shadows of their former strength, tigers abandoned for lack of fuel, panthers destroyed by mechanical failure as often as enemy fire, while American battalions endured appalling losses, but never disappeared. Names replaced, hulls replaced, formations rebuilt again and again. And in the wreckage of Normandy, the truth of modern warfare became undeniable, that battles were no longer decided by the finest weapon, but by the ability to keep fighting when plans failed, when machines broke, when men were lost. And in this brutal arithmetic the Sherman tank, so often criticized for what it lacked, proved invaluable for what it offered: reliability, simplicity, and above all, availability, a machine that showed up where and when it was needed, carried men forward under fire, and could be fixed, replaced, and sent back into battle faster than any opponent could respond. And long after the hedgerows were breached, and the German armor lay rusting in Norman fields, this lesson would echo far beyond June 6th, shaping doctrines, factories, and future wars. Because the Sherman was never meant to be remembered as the best tank of its era. It was meant to do a job, to break a wall, to support frightened infantry, to survive long enough to make the next advance possible. And in that role, it succeeded imperfectly and at terrible cost, but decisively. And today, when visitors walk along Omaha Beach, and see the preserved hull of a Sherman bearing the scars of battle. It stands not as a monument to superior technology, but to an idea that courage multiplied by preparation and sustained by industry can overcome even the most daunting defenses. That wars are won not by flawless machines, but by systems that endure. And that on that gray morning in Normandy, when the first Sherman ground its tracks into wet sand and refused to stop, the fate of the war in the West quietly, irrevocably began to turn.